Think of the 4th of July, and you probably picture a massive summer spectacle. Hot dogs on the grill, blockbuster movie releases, and hundreds of millions of people gathering to watch laser shows and massive fireworks displays. But the story begins in a cramped, humid room on the second floor of a brick townhouse in Philadelphia. There, surrounded by the smell of melting tallow candles and horse manure from the street below, a 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson sat at a portable wooden desk, feverishly scratching out 56 lines of text. By adopting this unanimous declaration, the Second Continental Congress signed a treason warrant. King George III commanded the largest military force on the planet, and a British armada was already dropping anchor in New York Harbor. These delegates were staring down the gallows. They needed a psychological tool to unify 13 fractured colonies before the Crown's military could dismantle them. Even in that terrifying moment of existential risk, they understood the need to manufacture a sense of shared identity. On July 3, 1776, John Adams wrote a letter to his wife Abigail, predicting that succeeding generations would need a grand anniversary festival to sustain their new republic. He laid out a very specific vision for how Americans should celebrate, with solemn devotion, parades, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations stretching from one end of the continent to the other. Adams was accurate about the methods, though he missed the actual date. He assumed the holiday would fall on July 2nd, the day Congress actually voted for the Resolution of Independence. Instead, the public imagination latched on to July 4th. That was the day the text was formally adopted and sent to the presses. Looking at this printed Dunlap broadside, you can see how the bold header reading, "In Congress, July 4th, 1776, cemented the date in the minds of the colonists who read it. Adams and his colleagues had established a date specifically intended for annual civic reflection, a recurring anchor on the calendar to prevent the public from losing their nerve. Exactly 1 year later, that nerve was being tested. The Continental Army was reeling from a brutal winter encampment. George Washington's troops were underfunded, underclothed, and engaged in a desperate fight just to keep the revolution alive. Meanwhile, civilians faced an immediate threat. British troops were actively maneuvering through Pennsylvania, preparing an invasion. On this 1777 map, Philadelphia sits right in the crosshairs. As the primary target for the British military, the city was bracing for occupation. It was arguably the most dangerous time and location to host a loud public celebration. Yet, despite the real threat to their lives, the citizens of Philadelphia improvised a defiant party. They refused to let their 1-year milestone pass in silence. That celebration established the essential framework we still follow today. The first pillar was artillery. At dawn, 13 gunshots echoed across the Delaware River, and at noon, armed vessels fired a coordinated broadside. The gunpowder and cannons created a soundscape of freedom, a loud reminder of the violent sacrifice required to secure their rights. The second pillar was illumination. As dusk fell, citizens placed lit candles in their windows. This functioned as a neighborhood loyalty test. Darkened windows during the celebrations were immediately suspected of belonging to British sympathizers. Organizers even hired a military band composed entirely of captured Hessian prisoners of war to play patriotic tunes, a triumphant touch that delighted the local crowds. Finally, they utilized public oration and community banquets. By reading the full text of the Declaration aloud in town squares, leaders forged a unified national identity out of diverse, fractured regional cultures. That single day in war-torn Philadelphia established the specific traditions that Americans would repeat for the next 2.5 centuries. As the grueling war dragged on through 1778 and 1779, military and political leaders recognized the power of this holiday. They turned civilian defiance into a formalized military tool. George Washington officially weaponized this morale boost while camped in New Jersey in 1778. He ordered a double allowance of rum for his troops and wore a green sprig in his hat to mark the occasion. Soon after, the date was locked into the political calendar. In 1781, Massachusetts became the first state to cement July 4th as an official state holiday. What began as a spontaneous protest successfully evolved into a strategic, state-sanctioned asset for public morale. The final maturation of the holiday followed the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Looking at these signatures and red wax seals, you are seeing the moment American independence was finally secured in the eyes of the world, officially removing the threat of the gallows. This international recognition allowed the 4th of July to shed its treasonous origins. It transformed from a risky political statement into the primary secular sacrament of the new republic. Modern pyrotechnics and parades are the continuation of a 250-year-old survival ritual. This date was designed by desperate people to keep a fragile idea alive in the dark.
Welcome back to The Explainer. So, picking right up where we left off in The Biography of a Republic's Birthday, we're diving into Chapter 2, The Golden Jubilee and the Providential Omen. All right, picture this. The year is 1826, and America is gearing up for its Golden Jubilee. Now, we're going to unpack a moment in history that honestly sounds way more like a Hollywood movie script than actual recorded history. We're looking at a bittersweet national milestone, a completely mind-boggling coincidence, and the hidden fractures of a growing nation. You see, this wasn't just another annual summer cookout. This was a highly solemn moment of transition. The baton of leadership was officially passing from the revered founding fathers to an entirely new generation of Americans, a generation who had only ever known life under the American flag. The entire country was gripped by this sort of historical fever, super eager to celebrate 50 years of survival and expansion. And just to put things into perspective, the country had exploded from this fragile little coastal coalition of 13 colonies in 1776 into a massive continental powerhouse of 24 states fueled by new industry by 1826. The wilderness was actively being carved into farmland. Massive infrastructure projects like the Erie Canal were linking the Atlantic seaboard directly to the Great Lakes, and early steam locomotives were just beginning to chug across the countryside. The nation had, for all intents and purposes, grown up. But, the national mood was actually kind of bittersweet. That legendary revolutionary generation, they were vanishing into the grave, leaving only 3 original signers of the Declaration of Independence still alive. The men and women who had lived through the brutal war, who had heard George Washington speak or watched Thomas Jefferson draft the foundational documents, were fading away. The citizens of 1826 knew they were losing their direct living link to their own founding mythology, so they leaned heavily on these final 3 titans, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Charles Carroll. So just days before the big Jubilee, Thomas Jefferson pens this incredibly powerful final letter from his estate in Monticello, Virginia. He boldly urges the world to, quote, burst the chains of oppression. The citizens of Washington, D.C. had actually sent an invitation to Jefferson, but at 83 and in failing health, he was just too ill to travel. Instead, he wrote this massive political statement on June 26th. He envisioned the American experiment as a global signal to cast off monkish ignorance and superstition, really hoping the annual return of July 4th would forever refresh their devotion to the rights of man. Then, the morning of July 4th, 1826 arrives, and the entire nation just erupts. We're talking bells chiming, cannons roaring, and massive parades featuring surviving veterans. Across Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, the preparations had reached an absolute fever pitch. Crowds packed tightly into town squares and churches just to hear live readings of the Declaration of Independence. And those surviving Revolutionary War veterans, they were treated like absolute royalty, riding through these chaotic, cheering crowds in open carriages, all wrapped up in their faded blue and buff military uniforms. But here's where the story gets really wild. While the festive artillery is literally booming outside, there is this quiet, deeply dramatic split screen of history unfolding indoors for 2 of America's greatest founders. While the new generation is partying in the streets, high on a hilltop in Virginia, and inside a modest home in Massachusetts, the primary author and the chief defender of the Declaration of Independence are both on their deathbeds. The simultaneous timing of their final hours on this exact day remains one of the most astonishing historical facts on record. Down in Virginia, drifting in and out of consciousness the night before, a dying Jefferson actually has to ask his doctor, is it the 4th? He knew exactly what the approaching day signified, and it really seemed like he was holding on by sheer willpower just to see the dawn of the Golden Jubilee. He lay in his alcove bed, surrounded by family, his incredible intellect finally yielding to time, but his focus remained fiercely fixed on the date itself. And the poetic timing here is just staggering. Jefferson draws his final breath at 12:50 p.m. That is exactly 50 years to the hour after the Continental Congress officially approved the text of his declaration. Think about the historical weight of that moment. 50 years earlier, he's this young, brilliant Virginian anxiously watching Congress debate his words. Now, half a century later, to the very minute, as those same words are being enthusiastically shouted in town squares across a massively expanded nation, his story comes to a close. Meanwhile, 500 miles north, as the afternoon fades into evening, a dying John Adams utters his famous, tragic final words, entirely unaware that his old friend had passed hours earlier. The 90-year-old Adams lay in Quincy, Massachusetts, listening to the loud, booming Jubilee artillery rattling his windows. Stirring one last time, he found comfort in the thought that his great rival and lifelong friend was still out there. Thomas Jefferson survives, but he was mistaken. Jefferson had passed 6 hours before him. At 6:20 p.m., John Adams closed his eyes for the last time. So when horseback careers and fast riverboats finally spread the news of this miraculous simultaneous death, the 19th century public didn't just see a cool coincidence, they saw a providential omen. You have to remember, there were no telegraphs or social media back then. As the news physically traveled across the landscape over days and weeks, an absolute wave of awe swept through the American public. To the mind of a citizen in 1826, losing both the author and the defender of the Declaration on the exact 50th anniversary was mathematically impossible to be random chance. This perceived divine seal of approval literally overnight turned these joyous Jubilee parties into awestruck memorial services. In eulogy after eulogy, from local ministers to prominent politicians, the message was uniform. A higher power had taken Jefferson and Adams home on July 4th specifically to prove that the United States held a unique, sacred place in human history. The shock of the event created a profound, almost mystical sense of national unity. Which brings us to our next section, Cracks in the Republic, the reality behind the Jubilee. Because right behind that providential unity, some really severe fractures were forming. As incredible as the omens and the celebrations were, they functioned as a beautiful veneer masking a house that was quietly dividing against itself. The reality of the Jacksonian age was defined by three massive looming crises: a toxic sectional crisis dividing the states, the aggressive dispossession of native nations through westward expansion, and the glaring, unfulfilled promises of liberty for Black Americans. These weren't minor political disagreements, guys. These were foundational cracks in the very architecture of the Republic that the founders had left behind for this new generation to solve. Take the Missouri Compromise of 1820, for example. The geographical divide over slavery had become so toxic that even the July 4th toasts exposed this deepening sectional crisis. While everyone was technically raising a glass to the same country, the language they used revealed entirely different visions for America's future. The sources note that Southern celebrations heavily emphasized states' rights, implicitly guarding the institution of slavery, whereas Northern toasts leaned heavily into union and liberty. The ideological line dividing free and slave states had firmly been drawn right across the map. Simultaneously, while white Americans were celebrating 50 years of independence, indigenous nations were facing forced displacement that would ultimately culminate in the Trail of Tears. That grand expansion into a continental power of 24 states meant the wilderness being carved into farmland was very often ancestral homeland. The narrative of growing American liberty directly contradicted the stark reality of forced removal for Native communities, a glaring irony that was entirely omitted from the Jubilee's self-congratulatory celebrations. And just 26 years after this Golden Jubilee, Frederick Douglass would completely shatter the illusion with an incredibly scathing speech highlighting the sheer hypocrisy of a nation celebrating liberty while holding 4 million human beings in bondage. Douglass essentially held a mirror up to the soaring rhetoric of 1776 and 1826, forcing the country to look at its own shadow. He powerfully articulated that the glorious rights and the divine omens celebrated by the white population were a bitter, cruel mockery to those trapped in the rising toxic shadow of human slavery. So, the bittersweet Jubilee of 1826 proved that the United States would indeed outlast its founders, but it also laid bare the fact that the grand promises made back in 1776 were still desperately unfulfilled. The simultaneous passing of Jefferson and Adams on that momentous day provided a beautiful closing bracket to the founding era. However, the deep fractures regarding human rights, slavery, and expansion proved that the Declaration of Independence was not a completed achievement, but rather an ongoing, highly demanding assignment handed down to every subsequent generation. Which brings us to a really critical thought to end this explainer on. When we look past those miraculous omens and confront the actual historical reality, how do we take up that unfinished assignment in our own era? This incredible story of 1826 shows us a nation capable of immense reverence for liberty, yet blindingly flawed in its application. As we wrap up this chapter, ask yourself how the unfulfilled promises of the Golden Jubilees still echo in our modern world, and what your role is in continuing that assignment today. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep seeking the reality behind the history. All right, let's jump right into Chapter 3 of our Historical Explainer, where we're looking at the profound juxtaposition of America in 1876. This is such a fascinating period because we're looking at a nation boasting this soaring, almost unimaginable ambition on the outside, while at the exact same time, it's grappling with incredibly deep and painful fractures on the inside. It's really a story of a shiny facade masking a very complicated reality. And understanding this contrast is absolutely essential to understanding the American story as a whole. Right off the bat, we have to confront a massive paradox. I mean, how could a country that had literally just slaughtered its own brothers celebrate a century of unity? As the United States approached its 100th anniversary in 1876, the nation was bleeding, it was exhausted, and the wounds of the recent past were still incredibly fresh. Section 1. A nation soaked in blood. Before we can even look at the bright lights of 1876, we have to look at the shadows. Just 11 years prior to the centennial, the American Civil War had ended. This was a catastrophe that claimed over 600,000 lives. It utterly destroyed the Southern economy and shattered families from Maine all the way down to Texas. You simply cannot overstate the collective trauma a number like that represents for a country. And honestly, the staggering death toll was just part of the story. The nation was weighed down by a severely fractured era. The country was slogging through the agonizing final months of Reconstruction. Racial violence was rampant in the South. On top of that, a financial panic had plunged the entire country into a severe economic depression starting in 1873, and federal politics were totally mired in messy scandals surrounding President Ulysses S. Grant. So this was the incredibly tense atmosphere of the nation as its 100th birthday approached. Section 2. The 1876 Centennial Exposition. So, how did the government respond to this immense, multi-layered trauma? Did they hold a solemn day of remembrance? Nope. They threw an absolutely massive birthday party in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park. The scale of the Centennial Exposition is just staggering when you think about it. 285 acres, over 200 buildings, 37 visiting nations. Over a 6-month period, nearly 10 million visitors passed through its turnstiles. To put that into perspective, that was 1 out of every 5 Americans alive at the time. It was the very first official World's Fair ever held in the United States. Section 3. Machinery and Industrial Might. Now, this World's Fair wasn't just some nostalgic look back at 1776. It was a triumphant, very loud announcement of America stepping onto the world stage as a global industrial colossus. And nowhere was this ambition more perfectly encapsulated than in Machinery Hall. Sitting directly in the center was the crown jewel, this 700-ton mechanical monster called the Corliss Double Centennial Steam Engine. Standing 40 feet tall, this single giant engine provided power to more than 8,000 other machines across the hall through miles of rotating overhead shafts and belts. It's just wild to picture. When President Grant and Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil turned the starting cranks on May 10, 1876, the giant engine hummed to life without a single sound. It instantly began driving pumps, printing presses, looms, and saws all across this massive hall. And this silently humming engine brilliantly illustrates the country's transformation, right? Moving away from the agrarian, revolutionary outpost of the past and boldly stepping into the industrial future as a new world leader in technological innovation. But the Corliss engine wasn't the only marvel there. Let's take a rapid-fire look at some of the incredible debuts at this fair. Alexander Graham Bell demonstrated his telephone publicly for the very first time. Visitors could actually pay 50 cents to climb a ladder inside the right arm of the Statue of Liberty to raise money for its pedestal in New York. You also had the Remington typewriter demonstrating automated secretarial typing, and, get this, even Heinz tomato ketchup was introduced to the American palate for the very first time. And the reaction to all of this innovation was just pure awe. Emperor Dom Pedro's utter astonishment at Bell's telephone, where he literally exclaimed, "My God, it talks." That perfectly captures the mechanical wonder of the fair. For the white northern industrial leaders who organized the event, it was the perfect facade. It was this pristine celebration of technological triumph and national reconciliation. Section 4. The Unseen and Excluded. Okay, Now we need to pull back the curtain for a second and look at the reality of who was actually left out of this grand celebration. A quick glance at a timeline of that very same summer reveals tightly clustered events that completely shattered the pristine image of a unified nation. While millions were marveling at steam engines, the country outside the fairgrounds was actively engaged in profound, violent struggles. For example, literally just days before the grand 4th of July celebration at the fair, the Battle of the Little Big Horn took place in the Montana Territory. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and 268 men of the U.S. 7th Cavalry were wiped out by Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces. When the shocking news of Custer's catastrophic defeat actually reached the fairgoers in Philadelphia on July 6th, it instantly shattered the myth of total Western pacification. Instead of unity, it sparked renewed, intense federal military campaigns against Native peoples. Furthermore, the experience of African Americans at the Centennial painted a really stark picture of the nation's ongoing racial divide. The famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass was permitted to sit on the grandstand during the opening ceremonies. However, he was initially stopped by police officers who completely refused to believe a black man belonged in the diplomatic section. They only relented when a U.S. senator intervened. This incident stood as a grim, glaring symbol for Black Americans, who in 1876 were watching the tragic dismantling of Reconstruction, the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, and the devastating rise of Jim Crow disenfranchisement. And in another glaring exclusion, despite celebrating a century of American liberty, women were not even permitted to speak at the official July 4th ceremony at Independence Hall. But, as you might guess, they were undeterred. Suffragist leader Susan B. Anthony and 4 companions literally crashed the stage without permission. They marched right up, handed a written copy of the Declaration of Rights for Women to Vice President Thomas Ferry, scattered copies to the gasping crowd, and marched right back outside. Marching to a nearby wooden platform, Anthony read the document aloud to the crowd. She declared, "Our faith is broader and deeper than that of the yellowest patriot. We ask for justice, we ask for equality, we ask that all the civil and political rights that belong to citizens of the United States be guaranteed to us and our daughters forever." Her soaring words remind us of a powerful truth here. While the giant coreless engine hummed silently in Machinery Hall, marginalized citizens outside had to shout just to be heard.
Section 5. A fragmented moral core. So how do we reconcile the brilliant innovation of the Centennial with the deep societal exclusions happening at the exact same time? Well, the Centennial Exposition proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that industrial machinery, the gears, the steam, the telegraphs, could absolutely successfully unite a country geographically and economically. But that was the facade. The reality was that the moral core of democratic equality within the nation remained deeply fragmented.
As we wrap up our look at Chapter 3 in this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. Does technological advancement automatically equal social progress, or does it sometimes just mask the fractures underneath? I mean, when we build a better machine, do we necessarily build a better society? Keep that question in mind as we continue to examine the building of modern America. Hey everyone, welcome back to the explainer. Let's pick up exactly where we left off. We're diving straight into Chapter 4, the bicentennial of 1976 and how it helped heal a modern republic. Now, to truly get why 1976 was such a miracle, you've got to understand the absolute emotional hangover the country was suffering from at the time. I mean, national morale had flatlined. It was at an all-time low. The whole idea of throwing a massive national birthday party, honestly, it felt almost insulting to the average citizen. You see, the public was reeling. Just take a look at this timeline. First, you have the massive trauma of the Vietnam War, ending with the fall of Saigon. This was the first major war America had lost, and it absolutely shattered the trust between the public and military leadership. And then, right in the middle of all that, you have the Watergate scandal. President Nixon is forced to resign in disgrace in 1974, which pretty much destroyed faith in the presidency itself. The national mood? Grim, angry, totally exhausted. But, spoiler alert, something incredible happened in July of 1976 that turned it all around. Before we get to that healing, though, we really need to talk about the financial reality on the ground. Economically, the nation was just getting battered by stagflation. And hey, this wasn't just some dry textbook economic term. It was a daily, painful reality. Just imagine dealing with soaring inflation, waiting in these massive, endless gas lines because of the OPEC oil embargo, and all the while, your paycheck isn't going up one bit. Because of this incredibly toxic mix, commentators universally predicted that the upcoming 1976 bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the United States, was going to be a complete and utter flop. The public was simply too cynical and, frankly, too broke to care. So what happened? Well, at first, the planning was totally bogged down in the usual political infighting. The original plan was to throw this giant centralized World's Fair in Philadelphia, but that completely collapsed. It was just crushed by cost concerns and local political opposition. But, that failure forced a totally brilliant pivot. The American Revolution Bicentennial Administration, or ARBA, made a conscious choice. They completely abandoned the idea of a massive top-down party in Washington or Philly. Instead, they decided to empower thousands of decentralized local communities. And this pivot, it turned everyday patriotic pop culture into a totally viral grassroots phenomenon. Instead of one big, stiff official party, the celebration happened everywhere. Small towns, big cities, you name it. The U.S. Mint released special bicentennial quarters and even reissued the $2 bill featuring the Declaration of Independence. And municipalities just went all out. I'm talking street crosswalks painted red, white, and blue. They even repainted ordinary fire hydrants to look like tiny revolutionary soldiers. You had celebrities hosting daily bicentennial minutes on TV, and even commercial companies jumped on the bandwagon. With branded cereal boxes and red, white, and blue cars, it was everywhere. But out of all these incredible local efforts, absolutely nothing captured the national imagination quite like the Freedom Train. This thing was a massive, steam-powered 21-car train painted entirely in red, white, and blue. And it didn't just sit in some museum gathering dust. No, it spent 21 months traveling across all 48 contiguous states. It brought the celebration directly to the people, no matter where they lived. And the response? Unbelievable. 7 million. That is the staggering number of citizens who stood outside in miles-long lines just for the chance to walk through those train cars. I mean, think about that for a second. In an era defined by deep cynicism, political disappointment, and serious economic frustration, 7 million people took time out of their busy lives to participate in this traveling exhibit. So what on earth were they waiting so long to see? Well, they were waiting to see some truly incredible, iconic artifacts. The Freedom Train carried actual pieces of history, like an original copy of the Constitution and Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence. But it wasn't just about 1776, which is the really cool part. The train seamlessly connected the foundational republic to modern American achievements. They had Martin Luther King Jr.'s pulpit Bible on display and even actual lunar rock samples from the Apollo 11 moon landing. It was this beautiful traveling reminder of the nation's highest ideals and greatest milestones. So all of this grassroots energy, the painted hydrants, the Freedom Train, it all culminated on a single, unforgettable day, Sunday, July 4th, 1976. And it was nothing short of miraculous. Those dark clouds of 1970s cynicism, they just seemed to completely fade away. Millions of Americans, totally exhausted from the traumas of the decade, finally stepped out of their homes and into the streets to celebrate together. It ended up being a massive collective emotional reset for the entire country. Let's bounce across the country for a minute to check out the spectacles of that day, starting with the flagship event over on the East Coast. In New York Harbor, the public was treated to Operation Sail 1976. This was a breathtaking naval parade featuring a fleet of 16 majestic, square-rigged, tall ships. And these were sent from maritime organizations and navies all over the world: Japan, Colombia, West Germany, even the Soviet Union. These gorgeous vessels sailed right past the Statue of Liberty, escorted by dozens of modern warships and thousands of private civilian sailboats. Just an awe-inspiring display of global unity. Jumping down to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., the mood was equally powerful, but much more contemplative. President Gerald Ford spoke at the Lincoln Memorial. And what's really fascinating here is that he completely avoided taking some boastful political victory lap. He knew the country didn't need arrogance right then. It desperately needed quiet, overdue national healing. He struck this incredible tone of profound reconciliation, acknowledging the pain of the recent past while looking forward. Just listen to these profound words from his speech that day. We must let our feelings show. We must store up reserved memories of this day to draw upon in the years ahead. That perfectly captures the exact sentiment of the day, doesn't it? It wasn't about projecting boastful government pride, not at all. It was a gentle, necessary call to repair a fractured nation and find some common ground. Meanwhile, over in Philadelphia, there was an incredibly poignant moment. Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom paid an official state visit. Think about the historical weight of that for a second. It was a profound symbol of reconciliation between the old empire and the republic they fought to break away from. She presented the American people with the bicentennial bell. Get this, it was actually cast in the exact same London foundry as the original Liberty Bell, and it bore the inscription, "Let freedom ring." And finally, as the sun went down, the focus shifted over to Boston. On the banks of the Charles River, legendary composer Arthur Fiedler led the Boston Pops Orchestra. They played Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, but they didn't just use standard instruments for this. The night literally exploded with real military artillery cannons and a massive fireworks show, all performed live for an audience of 400,000 spectators. It was this triumphant, deafening, joyful cap to just an unbelievable day. So what's the ultimate takeaway from all this history? Well, it proves a vital truth about the nation's psychology. Citizens were actually able to separate two conflicting ideas. On one hand, they held deep disappointment, trauma, and a total lack of trust in their contemporary 1970s politicians and military leaders. But crucially, that did not extinguish their enduring love for the foundational principles of 1776. Patriotism wasn't tied to blind trust in the government, it was tied to the ideals of the republic itself. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to really chew on. How can we apply the lessons of 1976 to our own times today? How do we separate our love for foundational ideals from our inevitable disappointment in contemporary politics? The bicentennial showed us that a decentralized, grassroots love of country, driven by the people themselves in their own communities, can absolutely still heal a modern republic. It's a fascinating piece of history with a lesson that feels, honestly, more relevant today than ever. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep reflecting on how history continues to shape our present. Welcome back to our Explainer series. Picking up right where we left off in our previous chapters, today we are officially entering Chapter 5, The Road to 250. We're diving straight into 2026 to uncover the truly monumental planning and, honestly, the deeply complex landscape behind America's 250th anniversary. It's a massive, massive undertaking that's essentially been 50 years in the making, ever since the bicentennial way back in 1976. Now look at that absolute mouthful of a word, semi-quincentennial. I mean, it almost looks like a typo, right? But it's actually a Latinate construction. So semi means half, quinca means 5, and centennial means 100. Put it all together and you've got a quarter millennial. But let's be real, knowing that is quite a mouthful for everyday conversation. The official National Commission really smartly rebranded the whole public effort as America 250, just to make it accessible to everyone. So here's our quick roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. Milestones of memory, 2. The modern landscape, 3. Flagship national initiatives, 4. July 4th on the national stage, and finally, 5. Grassroots memory and tomorrow. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Milestones of Memory. To really grasp the sheer magnitude of 2026, we first need to see how these big anniversaries act as mirrors for their specific eras. Just look at this historical journey. We jump from a war-torn, highly defiant first anniversary in Philadelphia in 1777 all the way to the 100th centennial in 1876, which, if you remember, was this intense mix of industrial triumph and really deep post-Civil War pain. Then we move forward to the 1976 bicentennial, an era mostly about post-Watergate healing, marked by those iconic tall ships. And that brings us right to 2026, America 250. This is what we're calling the digital civic age. Which brings us to Section 2, Navigating the Modern Landscape. 50 years after the 1976 bicentennial, it's safe to say this anniversary is unfolding in a highly unique and challenging environment. First up, there's digital satiation. Unlike previous milestones, information today moves at the literal speed of algorithms. Think about it, we're consuming our history somewhere right between our TikTok feeds and generative AI prompts. Second, we have political hyperpolarization. The national conversation around history right now is deeply contentious, trying to balance this deep pride in American accomplishments with an honest confrontation of historical injustices. And third, global turbulence, rising geopolitical tensions, those rapid AI disruptions we mentioned, and shifting demographics really make this milestone a period of deep existential reflection. So, how do you actually meet an incredibly complex moment like this? Well, Congress created the nonpartisan United States Semi-Quincentennial Commission, and their core goal is to engage 350 million Americans. And that staggering number isn't just focused on the lower 48, not at all. It spans a massive multi-year effort across all 50 states, 6 territories, and even international diplomatic allies. Moving right along to Section 3, Flagship National Initiatives. Now, rather than just building a single static monument, 2026 is actually designed around dynamic nationwide programs. Step 1 is Sail 250. This is going to revive that beloved visual spirit of 1976 with an international fleet of tall ships and Navy vessels sailing right into major ports. Step 2 is America's Block Party, which is a really cool nationwide push providing grants for local, grassroots neighborhood events and historical preservation. Step 3 is Giving Forth, partnering up with civic organizations for a massive national service and mid-year philanthropy campaign over the holiday weekend. Step 4, Rededicate 250, will feature interfaith national gatherings focused on unity right on the National Mall. And finally, Step 5, the U.S. Mint is issuing new, limited edition circulating quarters and coins that celebrate key moments of this quarter millennium.
All right, let's look at Section 4, July 4th on the national stage.
Let's dive into the big day itself. In Washington, D.C., a massive, full-day spectacle is going to unfold along the National Mall. Just picture this, state-by-state cultural pavilions showcasing the incredible diversity of the nation. The skies above will be filled with military flyovers, the grounds will host these vivid historical reenactments, and the whole thing culminates in massive evening fireworks projected brilliantly over the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. It's going to be spectacular.
But up in Philadelphia, well, a strikingly poignant contrast is going to take place over at Independence Hall. You'll have 56 descendants of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence gathered together in the courtyard. But here's the amazing part. They won't be reading the document alone. In a deeply symbolic gesture, they're going to be joined on stage by 56 newly naturalized American citizens, immigrants from every corner of the earth taking their official oath of allegiance right on the nation's 250th birthday. It literally bridges the foundational past with the continuing future of the country, showing that the American story is, without a doubt, still being written.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, Grassroots Memory and Tomorrow.
Yet, the most historic elements of 2026 might not actually be those mega spectacles at all. Out in small towns across the country, the true memory of America 250 is being forged through quiet, highly reflective actions. You have high school students meticulously digitizing local Revolutionary and Civil War letters so they can live forever in open access databases. You have indigenous tribal nations leading storytelling circles, sharing the rich native history that long predate 1776. And you have local historical societies bearing digital and physical time capsules, packed with the very essence of what it means to be alive today in this digital civic age.
Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought. Those time capsules being buried by historical societies, they're scheduled to be opened on July 4th, 2276, for the quincentennial. So when those capsules are finally unearthed in 2276, what story will we have left behind for them to discover? How will they view our navigation of digital satiation and all this current polarization? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer of America 250. I really hope this breakdown helped bring the monumental plans for Chapter 5 to life. Keep reflecting on our history, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Welcome back to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. We're picking up our historical narrative today with Chapter 6, which focuses on the unfinished work. I want you to imagine something with me. Picture the night of July 4th, 2026. The massive, spectacular semi-quincentennial fireworks over the Potomac have finally cleared out. But, as the echoes of those celebrations fade away, there's this massive fundamental question just sort of hovering in the air for all of us. And that question is, what does 250 years of self-government actually mean? Well, today we're unpacking exactly why the American experiment is, frankly, far from a finished product. And we're taking a really deep look at the blueprint for the next quarter millennium.
To really get a grip on this blueprint, we've got to completely shatter this illusion of the Declaration of Independence as some, static museum artifact just locked away under thick glass. If you're only seeing it as a dusty piece of old parchment, you're honestly missing its raw, world-changing power. During the legendary 1963 March on Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. offered just a brilliant metaphor for this. He didn't describe our founding documents as finished, closed contracts. No, he described the Declaration as a demanding, living document. He famously called it a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. Think about that. It was basically a giant check written on the vault of human freedom. And as we all know, a promissory note requires collection. It literally demands that the bank actually has the funds to back up the ink on the paper.
Now, what's really interesting about all this is the stark reality of what happened when it was actually time to cash that check. The founders wrote a massive check on human freedom, sure, but back in 1776, it completely defaulted for huge foundational segments of the population. I mean, we are talking about Black Americans held in brutal chattel slavery. We are talking about women entirely denied the right to vote. We're looking at indigenous peoples being systematically stripped of their ancestral lands, and even working-class citizens who were totally shut out of the political process simply because they didn't own property. For all of these groups, the vault of freedom was slammed shut. The funds were tragically insufficient.
But here's the thing, that defaulted check absolutely wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was the inciting incident. If we really want to understand the history of America between the founding in 1776 and where we are today, it boils down to exactly this. It's the ongoing story of everyday citizens demanding that the nation honor and cash that promissory note. These aren't just, random dates passing by in a history book. They are massive tectonic shifts in human rights. Think about it. In 1863, we see the abolition of slavery. By 1920, the 19th Amendment finally secures women's suffrage. Jump ahead to 1965, and the Voting Rights Act strikes a monumental blow for racial equality. And honestly, we could add so many more moments to this timeline. The labor movement, disability rights, equal protection under the law. Every single one of these was a hard-fought battle to force the bank to finally honor the check. So how exactly were these incredible expansions of freedom achieved? Well, this is a really vital point in our explainer today. Activists throughout American history didn't achieve these major milestones by burning the Declaration of Independence. They didn't just tear up the original promissory note. No. Instead, they took that very document and held it up like a mirror, right to the nation's face. They pointed directly to the founding words and simply demanded, live up to your stated creed. They literally weaponized the nation's own foundational ideals against the very injustices the nation was committing. Honestly, it's one of the most powerful and effective strategies for social change in all of human history.
So, the crucial point is understanding the true miracle of the American experiment. And let me be clear, the miracle is absolutely not that the founders were flawless. Let's be real here. They were highly flawed 18th century guys sweating in a humid room who literally built a compromise with slavery directly into the structural foundation of the Constitution. No, the real miracle is this incredible self-correcting mechanism. They installed a very specific piece of technology right into the framework of the nation. Through the amendment process, the fierce protection of a free press, the right to public assembly, and of course the power of the ballot box, they built a system that was specifically designed with the capacity to evolve. They didn't hand us some fixed, unchangeable scripture. They handed us the actual tools to fix their own mistakes.
And, this completely reframes how we should view our history. We've got to avoid the trap of static perfection, viewing 1776 as this impossible, flawless standard. Because if we demand that our history be perfectly pure right from day one, well, the entire narrative just collapses. It simply wasn't pure. Instead, the actual American assignment is dynamic, continuous work. The founders explicitly invited future generations to construct a more perfect union. Catch that? Not a perfect union, but a more perfect one. That phrasing implies motion. It implies effort. It implies that the building is never, ever fully finished. We are the construction crew, and the site is always active.
Let's move to the next phase and see how this builds, because we can literally trace this dynamic, continuous work by looking at exactly who is included in those famous 3 words, we the people. Back in 1776, that meant a shockingly narrow demographic of primarily white, property-owning men. But as that self-correcting mechanism kicks in, the whole nation transforms. By the centennial in 1876, we are fundamentally changed, fighting to incorporate millions of newly freed Black Americans into the fabric of citizenship. Jump another 100 years to 1976, and the definition expands drastically again to include women voters, citizens of every ethnicity, and a booming middle class. And now, as we hit 2026, we the people represents over 340 million individuals in the most multi-ethnic, multi-religious, technologically advanced constitutional democracy in all of human history. The definition of we just relentlessly expands.
Okay, but let's shift our focus from the past for a second and look to the future. During the 250th anniversary, there are going to be new time capsules buried in the earth. It makes you wonder, who's going to be around to open them? In 2076, the nation will celebrate its tricentennial, 300 years. Fast forward a bit more to 2276, and citizens will gather for a massive 500-year mark, the quincentennial. Anticipating these huge milestones really drives home a profound realization. 2026 is definitely not the end of the American story. Honestly, it's not even the middle. The 250th anniversary is really just a station along an ongoing journey.
And this brilliantly illustrates what it's actually going to take to get there. Because reaching those far-off dates, it won't depend on military firepower. It won't depend on industrial wealth or just having technological superiority. No, it's going to depend entirely on what Thomas Jefferson penned in his final letter back in 1826, which, incredibly, he wrote just days before he died, on the actual 50th anniversary of July 4th. He wrote that the future requires an undiminished devotion to the rights of man. And in practical terms, that means the quiet, everyday civic duties. It means showing up to debate, to vote, to volunteer in your community. It means protesting peacefully when the check defaults again and relentlessly protecting the rights of your neighbors.
As long as citizens continue to step forward and actually use that self-correcting mechanism, the radical, crazy idea that was sparked in a humid Philadelphia room in the summer of 1776 is going to remain vibrantly alive. And that brings us to the ultimate question I want to leave you with today. We've talked a lot about what they did, the founders, the activists, the generations before us. But now, the historical they becomes the collective us. The experiment continues. The pen is no longer in Jefferson's hand. It has been passed directly to us. So how will our generation write the next chapter? What are we going to do to ensure that promissory note is cashed for the next generation? Think about that as you look toward the next horizon, and I'll see you next time.